Now, I have submitted, I think 2 of these, maybe even 3, as a mechanic over the years. What's going on, everybody? Bryce, your favorite A&P IA, back again with another video. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about making reports and reporting people to the FAA. So stick around and I'm going to get into it. But always, I'd like you to remember, please leave us a like and a comment. It helps with engagement on the video. I know subscribers and things like that don't count as much in the algorithm anymore, but you know, the channel is growing, it is starting to make some money, and hopefully I can start doing another giveaway here pretty soon. So I'm going to talk about 4 things that you can expect when making reports to the FAA. I'm going to talk about 1, what kind of reports there are, 2, who can make those reports, 3, when you should make those reports, and 4, when you should probably not make those reports. So stick around and we'll get into it. So the first thing, I'm going to talk about the 2 types of reports there are. Well, the first report would be something like a service difficulty report, or an SDR. Now, in general aviation especially, the FAA preaches SDRs, as they should, because a service difficulty report means that you are working on an aircraft and you had a difficulty servicing it in some way, shape, or form, or you found a defect. Now, I have submitted, I think 2 of these, maybe even 3, as a mechanic over the years. And I can tell you one that I remember very recently is I was working on an Aero at a flight school. And one of the cylinders on that engine had cracked clean around the barrel at the top of the head and almost separated in flight. And we thought, that was weird. So we took the cylinder off and we sort of inspected the engine for damage. And what we actually found when we were pulling the cylinder off next to it, because of course it was the one in the middle, when we pulled the cylinder off next to it to get it out, that cylinder's piston pin was worn excessively, and the piston could actually move like this in the cylinder. And I'm not like talking rotate on the pin, I'm talking the pin went through this way and the piston could actually move that way. So we ended up replacing that piston and that pin to solve that issue. And then I want to say it was probably, I don't know, a year later, and maybe 80 hours of flight, the same engine had an exhaust valve overheat, and the exhaust valve came apart and went through the turbo. And the pilot was able to return safely and land. And we look at the engine, and sure enough, we had to do another cylinder on it. But here's what was weird. It was a brand new engine from Continental, and if you're curious, it was a TSIO 360 Continental. It was a brand new engine from Continental that only had about 700 hours on it. So it shouldn't have been having these failures as early as it was. So I went ahead and submitted an SDR on it. But another example would be if you keep working on, let's say, a 737. Well, that's not a good example. Let's say keep it general aviation. Let's say you're working on a Piper Cherokee, and you keep coming across the same crack in the main spar, and on 4 or 5 different aircraft, you've repaired a crack in the main spar. Well, that's something that seems to be recurring and happening over and over and over again, and I would strongly suggest that you submit SDRs to the FAA for this, because what the FAA is going to do is take all of those SDRs and notice sort of a similar trend that these aircraft keep having the same issue in the same area, and eventually that will lead to the generation of an airworthiness directive to correct whatever unsafe condition that may be. Which leads me to my second point, which is who or what other type of report is there? The other type of report that there is reporting a person or an entity to the FAA. And I say an entity because you can call and report a maintenance facility for, bad maintenance practices or whatever it is. And typically those are submitted by mechanics and pilots, and we'll talk more about those in just a second. That does, however, lead me to my third point here, which is who can submit reports to the FAA? Well, the answer to that question really is anyone. You don't have to be an A&P to submit an SDR, and you don't have to be a pilot to submit a report against an aircraft that you felt was unairworthy. If you're just a mechanic, you can submit a report to the FAA. However, they are going to ask you for your information, and they're still going to try to get as much as they can from you. If you are an A&P, they are going to know who you are and where you are, and if, let's say, you submitted a false report, you said that maintenance facility over there is, not, they're not greasing landing gear, and the FAA comes by and they show them all of their, their grease guns on their records, and they are in fact greasing landing gear, the FAA is going to come back to you and say, why did you report this? It seems here that it was being done properly and in accordance with the manual. But to answer that question, really anybody can make a report to the FAA. Which leads me to my fourth point of when should you report people to the FAA? Well, truthfully, I say to you that I will only ever report someone to the FAA when A, I know that they are knowingly violating regulations, and B, they are not willing to change. And what I mean by that is, if I have an owner who is doing some of his own work on an aircraft, and I tell him, hey bud, you know you're really not supposed to be doing that kind of work on your own aircraft. And he says, oh, I had no idea. I thought under my private pilot's license I could do that. And I say, no, you actually have to have a mechanic supervise that. And he's willing to not do that thing anymore. Well, then I don't really feel the need to call the FAA on him. One, it's a customer. And two, he's admitted that he didn't know any better and is going to solve, and he's not going to do that anymore, right? And that's kind of a mild example. And I'm using that example for a reason. However, if I went to an owner and I said, hey, listen, I found a whole bunch of your tools all over this aircraft, this airframe, when I was doing the annual inspection on it, and a bunch of repairs that aren't in the logbooks. It has, brand new magneto on it that's not in the logbooks, or it has a sheet metal repair that's not in the logbooks. And he's like, oh, well, I did that myself. As an owner, I can do my own maintenance. I said, actually, no, you can't. You can only do preventative maintenance. And he is unwilling to change his opinion. Then I would probably call the FAA and not necessarily report him. I'd report him to a point, but I would also report the aircraft as having unapproved repairs done to it, and at that point the FAA will probably send out an airworthiness inspector to look at the aircraft and then to counsel the pilot. So that's going to lead me to what happens when the FAA is called on you, or when the FAA shows up asking questions about that reports that were made. Well, if you are doing things the right way, and if you're not violating regulations, it shouldn't be a problem, because you should have all of your parts tags and all of your logbook entries and all of your ducks in a row, as they say. And if you've made copies for your own records, which is something I very strongly recommend you do, I have personally had somebody take one of my records and try to write in between my signature and the description of work that something else was done in their own pen. And one of the things that I do to prevent that is I'll actually take the B on my first name, and I'll take the pen right over the end of the first sentence so that the signature touches the line above it, and you can't write things in there. Plus, if you're writing things in there, it has to be initialed. You can't just pin something into a typed logbook entry and expect it to fly. But when the FAA comes in and it says, hey, it says here in this logbook that you did this work, if I can pull open my own copy of that logbook from the computer or from a scanned file and say, well, here's my copy of it when I did it, and you can see that's not in there, I didn't do that. Or vice versa, if the FAA says, hey, somebody reported that you didn't fix this problem, that you didn't replace any of these parts, and you have logbook entries that back up what you're saying, you have a logbook entry that says you did those things, well, then ultimately you're going to be off the hook, and they're probably going to end up going back to that person who reported you. Now, I will leave you with this. I would strongly advise you against making reports to the FAA on other people. SDRs and parts and unapproved parts are one thing, but making reports on other people to the FAA is not usually a good idea, because aviation is still a very small community, and it's not a good idea to go around not making friends. Instead, I'm not going to say mind your business, that's not what I mean by this, but instead I would maybe have a conversation with that person and say, hey, just so you know, what you're doing is in violation of the regulations, and you probably shouldn't be doing that anymore. And if they refuse to listen to you, or something along those lines, then ultimately, if you have to make a report, you have to make a report. Fortunately for me, though, the owners that I keep and the clients that I keep are very, very kind, very polite, and they trust me to do their maintenance. They trust in my decisions, and they don't try to violate regulations and go out like a cowboy, if you will. So once again, that's going to do it for this video. I really appreciate you watching to the end. Be sure to leave us a like, leave us a comment, subscribe, go build something, and be easy.